Hey, I want you to grab your Bibles. I want you to go to Ephesians chapter 5 today. Ephesians chapter 5 is where we're going to be at today. There's a phrase that I recently heard, and I thought about it when I was getting ready for this particular message. It was a phrase that said this, that home can be heaven on earth. Home can be heaven on earth. And some of you hear that phrase and you're like, yeah, you know what? I do kind of feel like my home, man, it is kind of like a little slice of heaven. Home is kind of like heaven on earth. And some of you hear that phrase and you're like, I don't know what you're talking about. Because my home is far from feeling like heaven on earth. Some of you may even say, I don't know, but home and home life feels a little more like hell on earth than it does. And I don't know where you may be in the life of your home, in your relationships that are made up in your home. And for some of you, it may feel very much like a slice of heaven right now. For others of you, it may not be heaven or heavenly the way you describe relationships within your home right now. But today I want us to look at this section of Paul's letter as he wrote this letter to a group of Christians to the church in Ephesus. And in this section of his letter, he's saying this to them. He's saying, hey, as you are now following after Jesus. Remember, he's writing to Christians. He's saying to them, as you now are following after Jesus in your life, that should also affect how you do relationship within your family. The relationships between spouses, between husbands and wives. The relationships between parents and kids. His encouragement, his instruction is that now that you are following after Jesus and you are trying to live like Jesus in your life, it should affect your marriage relationship, how you do life as a husband and a wife. How you do life as parents and kids. And he gives these instructions and says, as you follow after Jesus, if you want to have a Christ-centered home, then here's some encouragement for you. Beginning in Ephesians chapter 5, verse 22, he's writing this, and he's going to give us this correlation. He is talking about marriage relationships here, and he's going to give this correlation between what the relationship is between Christ and his church. And his church, the people who are following after him. He says, hey, I want you to see how deep and meaningful the relationship, how important the relationship that Christ has with his church. And I want you to see that in correlation of how deep and meaningful your relationships should be at home, specifically right here within your marriage as a husband and wife. Look at Ephesians chapter 5, beginning in verse 22. Paul writes this, wives, submit to your own husbands as to the Lord. For the husband is the head of the wife, even as Christ is head of the church, his body, and is himself its Savior. Now, as the church submits to Christ, so also wives should submit in everything to their husbands. Husbands, love your wives as Christ loved the church and gave himself up for her, that he may sanctify her, having cleansed her by the washing of water with the word, so that he might present the church to himself in splendor, without spot or wrinkle or any such thing, that she might be holy and without blemish. In the same way, husbands should love their wives as their own bodies. He who loves his wife loves himself, for no one ever hated his own flesh, but nourishes and cherishes it, just as Christ does the church, because we are members of his body. Therefore, a man shall leave his father and mother and hold fast to his wife, and the two shall become one flesh. This mystery is profound, and I'm saying that it refers to Christ and the church. However, let each one of you love his wife as himself, and let the wife see that she respects her husband. Now, Paul writes and gives us a lot of instructions right here, but I think in verse 33, that last verse that we just read, he gives a summary of everything that he's saying. And he summarized it this way, and he says, wives, they need to be loved by their husbands, and husbands, they need to be respected by their wives. In this phrase, love and respect, I think Paul summarizes everything that he's saying of how the marriage relationship should be lived out. This phrase, love and respect, it's actually been taken in an entire book, an entire Bible study has been written about love and respect and what it can look like and what it should look like in a marriage. It's a study that we've done around marriage here that says this, that wives, they need to be and they need to feel loved by their husbands. And husbands, they need to feel and they need to be respected by their wife. And this cycle within a marriage, it will feed this marriage. It will feed your marriage either in a healthy way or in a destructive way. You see, when a wife feels loved by their husband, they in turn will show respect to their husband. And when a husband feels respected by their wife, it's easily they then will show love to their wife. And so in this positive way, as the wife shows respect to her husband, the husband shows respect and shows love to his wife, and it feeds each other and grows and matures. But the very opposite is true in the negative way. That love and respect can be fed in a destructive way, where a wife doesn't feel love from her husband, she in turn will not show him respect. And when the husband doesn't feel respected, he won't show love. And all of a sudden now they're feeding each other in a destructive way. Well, Paul is summarizing what he says here is that in your marriage, as you are following after Jesus, because remember he's writing to Christians, as you are following after Jesus, husbands, love your wives. Wives, respect your husbands. And in that, they will feed each other, and your marriage will become strong and healthy and centered around Jesus Christ. You see, in these teachings and everything that Paul just wrote in this section of his letter, I think there are three words, three truths that describe a Christ-centered marriage. I think there's three words that describe what a Christ-centered marriage will look like that we see here from Paul's writing. Now, as we unpack these today, here's the one thing I want you to do. I don't want you to think how your spouse should be living that out. Like, yeah, I've been telling him that. If she would just do that. I don't want you to listen to it from that perspective. I want you to listen to it. I want your hearts to be open from this perspective. How am I doing in that? What am I doing in this area? Three words that I think come out of what Paul writes here, these truths, these challenges that Paul writes. And I did the classic preacher thing today. Classic preacher thing. All three of these words are going to start with the same letter so you can remember them, okay? All three the same letter. First word that I see in Paul's writing here that will describe a Christ-centered marriage is this word submission. He wrote there and he said this, that wives should submit to your own husbands. Now, you need to hear this. Paul is not suggesting that women are inferior to men in any way. Paul is not saying that all women should be in subjection to all men in every situation. That's not what she's saying. He is saying this. He is talking about in a marriage relationship that is following after Jesus, that wives should submit to their husband. Now, what that does not mean for a wife is that you all of a sudden become a doormat to your husband. Don't become a slave. You don't become inferior to your husband. It does not mean that your husband can tell you everything to do and that you have to just blindly do everything that they say. What it does mean, and what Paul is encouraging here, is that a wife who is following after Jesus is making a choice to not resist her husband leading in their marriage or leading in their life together. That's what he says. That's what he's talking about. That what it means to submit is that you are making the choice not to resist allowing and following the lead of your husband in your marriage and in your life together. Submission going, okay, I want to follow your lead. There's something very, very important there, because this word submission, I don't believe just is following or just speaking to women. I think he's talking to the marriage relationship of women, that wives, you should submit to your husbands. Remember, he's talking to those who are following after Jesus, because there's this other side of that truth. Husbands, it actually starts with us submitting to Jesus Christ's lead in our life. Remember, he's talking about this correlation between Christ and the church. And he says that you as a husband, a husband that's trying to follow after Jesus, this submission in your marriage actually starts with you being submissive to Jesus Christ. Where you in your life are going, I'm trying to follow the lead. I'm letting Jesus be the king of my life, be the Lord of my life, govern and rule over me. And I am following under submission under who Jesus Christ wants me to be as a husband. Do you realize, husbands, how important it is for you, for us, to follow under the submission and be submissive to Jesus Christ? Then actually allows us and then makes it easier for our wives to submit to our lead, because now she knows what is leading my husband is Jesus Christ. I see it in his life. When our wives see us living in submission to Jesus Christ, husbands, when our wives see us being submissive to the role of Jesus Christ in our life, it makes it much easier for her to follow our lead, because she knows that Jesus is leading us. See, so many times I think we as men, maybe even Christian men, we like, hey, our wives should be submissive to us, but you don't even realize that it actually starts with you being submissive to Jesus Christ in your life. If we don't have a Christ-centered marriage, then submission has to be a word that is lived out and prevalent. Now, I understand this. I know the reality of our church family. I know that in the reality of our church family, there are many wives who you are following after Jesus, and you are trying to follow after Jesus, but you may be in a marriage with a husband who is far from following after Jesus. Can I just tell you this, maybe a little side note? These instructions from Paul are not telling you that you need to violate any biblical principle in your life, or you need to violate any conviction of being a follower of Jesus just to follow the lead of your husband who is leading you outside of biblical truth. You don't have to violate biblical truth in your life if your husband is leading you outside of that biblical truth. But husbands that are following after Jesus, husbands that are trying to live this out, we should allow them to lead in marriage and lead in life, because they are being led by Jesus Christ. The second word that describes a Christ-centered marriage. Remember, I told you they're all going to be S's, so you can try to remember them today. The second word is sacrifice. Sacrifice. This should be something that is prevalent and visible within a marriage that is trying to follow after Jesus, a marriage that is Christ-centered. Remember, Paul is making this correlation between the depth of the relationship and the love between Christ and his church. And he's using that, giving us a picture of that, to correlate it between the marriage relationship between a husband and a wife, the love that a husband has for his wife. And he says this in verse 25, making that correlation. He says, husbands, love your wives as Christ loved the church and gave himself up for her. We know this about Jesus, that Jesus made it possible for people to be part of his church, to be in relationship with God, our Heavenly Father, by laying down his life and being crucified to this cross, suffering and dying. He gave it all for us. He says, just the way That Jesus showed the depth and the meaning of his love by just laying it all down and sacrificing himself. Husbands, you should have that heart posture and that attitude that you will lay whatever you need to lay down for the good of your marriage and the good of your spouse. I think spouses, husbands, and wives, we need to live out this word sacrifice in our marriages. Sacrifice, it comes from someone being selfless. Making a sacrifice for someone comes from a place of your heart having this posture of selflessness. But so many times we, in our culture, in our world, we live life from a place of selfishness. Sometimes we do it unknowingly, but we've just been wired that way, that it's all about me all the time. It's about what I want, it's about what I need, it's about where I'm And when that starts to flesh itself out in marriages, what begins to happen is a husband or a wife, they just become selfish and it's all about them all the time. I have sat down with so many couples over the years where I see strife and conflict, and they've gotten to this place and they've allowed themselves to get in this place where it's just all about them individually. Well, he's not doing this for me. She's not doing that for me. It's about me, 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 me. And then we start thinking about me, then we just blame the other person for not doing what I need and what I want. What Paul is saying here is what needs to be an attribute of your marriage relationship comes out of selflessness, and it's this attribute of sacrifice. 1 Corinthians chapter 13, Paul is writing to another church in Corinth, and he's writing about what true, authentic, biblical love is. Now, it's used so often in the context to encourage marriages. He's not necessarily talking about marriage, and he's talking about just relationships overall, specifically relationships within the church, and says, hey, this should be what love looks like. This is what true, authentic, biblical love is. And in one of his list of descriptions of love, he says, love is not selfish. That in your marriage, if you were going to love your spouse with biblical love, then you will not be selfish. You'll come from this place of selflessness that leads you to actions of sacrifice, where you lay down your own desires for the desires of your spouse. You lay down your own good for the good of your spouse, for the good of your marriage. And I just simply ask you this: are you willingly, selflessly sacrificing for your spouse? Are you willingly, selflessly sacrificing for the sake of your marriage? Sacrifice. It's got to be a word that would describe a Christ-centered marriage. The third word, yes, it starts with S. Sacred. I think we see Paul's writing here, and I think we see him talking about what it means to treat your marriage as something that is sacred. You know, in comparing, we've talked about this, in comparing the relationship between Christ and his church, comparing that and put that in correlation with the relationship between a husband and a wife, he says this in verse 26. He's talking about Jesus, correlating to what it looks like in a marriage, that he may sanctify her. That Jesus sanctified the church. That in our marriage we should sanctify, verse 27, so that he might present the church to himself in splendor, without spot or wrinkle or any such thing. That he might be holy, that she might be holy and blameless, without blemish. Put those words in the context of your marriage. That you sanctify your marriage. That you present your marriage without spot or wrinkle. that you present your marriage as holy and without blemish. See, this word sanctify, it means something is set apart. When something is consecrated, in the scriptures when we talk about that, we talk about something is set apart or sanctified for God's purposes. It means it's set aside as sacred. It's set aside as something that is holy and set aside for divine purposes, for the purposes of God. Well, Paul uses this language when he's talking about marriage. He says, your marriage should be sanctified. Your marriage should be set apart. Your marriage should be consecrated for the purpose of godly things. So when we start thinking about this, we should be thinking that, okay, the husband is to be set apart, belonging to his wife. The wife should be set apart, belonging to her husband, because it is sacred. And then all of a sudden, we begin to have this mindset where we look at our relationship, we look at our marriage maybe in a deeper way than we've ever looked at it before, and we look at it as something that is sacred. We look at something like our marriage is actually sacred and set apart for the purposes of God. Man, when something is sacred to us, what do we do to it? We do everything in our power to protect it. So when we start hearing Paul use these words like sanctify her, sanctify your marriage, present your marriage without blemish, without spot, present your marriage without any kind of wrinkle, present your marriage to be holy. In other words, what am I doing to protect my marriage so it is without spot, without blemish? What am I doing to protect my marriage so that it is sanctified, that it is sacred to me? So I think a question that we have to ask ourselves as husbands and wives, is there anything that I am doing that is bringing blemish to my marriage? Is there anything that I am doing to damage the sacredness of my marriage? Whether it's known or not known, whether it's seen or unseen. Are you as a husband, you as a wife who is trying to follow after Jesus, are you treating your marriage as something that is sacred, that is sanctified, that is set apart? Are you protecting it in every way that you can so that you can present it as holy, you can present it as spotless, as without blemish? These words that I've seen from Paul's writing here, these words of submission, of sacrifice, of sacred, they need to be something that is evident and words that would describe our marriage if we want to have a Christ-centered marriage, if we need to do marriage differently than we've done it before. Then Paul shifts gears a little bit in his writing, and he talks about another relationship within the family. He talks about the relationship between parent and child. Look at what he says here in chapter 6, beginning in verse 1. He says, "Children, obey your parents in the Lord, for this is right. Honor your father and mother. This is the first commandment with a promise, that it may go well with you and that you may live long in the land. Fathers, do not provoke your children to anger, but bring them up in the discipline and instruction of the Lord." And these 4 verses that Paul writes about this relationship between parents and kids, for a home and this parent-child relationship to be a Christ-centered relationship, I think there's 2 words that I would take out of this part of his writing. Now, I wasn't good enough to make these 2 start with the same letter, so you just have to remember them. First word is honor. He's talking about it from the perspective of a child honoring their father and mother. He says, hey, this is a command from God. It's part of the 10 commandments. It's the 5th commandment that God lists, and it's actually the first commandment that has a promise to it. When we read those commandments out of Exodus chapter 20, God gave to Moses these words, says, honor your father and mother, that your days may be long in the land that the Lord your God is giving you. In other words, what he says here, this is the promise of God, that if you follow this command, for the very first time, God says, you follow this command, then there's going to be a reward for that, and that is that you may live long in the land that the Lord your God is giving you. He says that children, we should honor our father and our mother. Now, I know that there's various stages, and I understand that as we go through life, that relationship between parent and child, it changes through time, right? Because the relationship that we have with our brand new infant is even different than the relationship that we have with our elementary age child and our teenager. And then all of a sudden changes completely when all of a sudden they move outside of our home and now they're living their young adult life. And then it changes even again when they start to enter life and get married and have children of their own, and we get to enter the grandparent world, which is incredible, by the way. But all of a sudden now, here's the reality is the child-parent relationship, the dynamics of it change, but I don't think this truth changes. No matter what stage that we're in, I think this is true, that we should honor our parents. I think honoring, it looks like this. It's about showing them respect. It's about accepting their authority and their wisdom. It's about obeying them. It's about appreciating them. And I understand that showing respect and accepting authority and obeying and appreciating looks different in every single one of those stages of parent-child relationship. But I think the truth is still there, and that is that no matter what stage of life we're in, as a child of my parent, I should show them honor by respecting them, by appreciating them. So I wonder, no matter what your age is, when you're on that side of the relationship, are you showing honor? Then he says this, from the direction of this relationship from parent to child. This word I want us to grab a hold of today is this word, disciple. In verse 4, he says this, fathers, I think we can put in there fathers and mothers, parents. Don't provoke your children to anger, but bring them up in the discipline and the instructions of the Lord. You know what he's talking about there? He's like, to disciple our kids, to teach them the things of God, to teach them the ways of God, to instruct them with the instructions of God. Parents, especially those parents that you still have children under your care inside of your home, can I just tell you, don't be afraid to correct your kids and show them the ways of Jesus. There is a stage of parent-child relationships where you get to become a little more of a friend as they get into adulthood. But while they're under your care at home, can I just tell you, you are not their friend. Don't be afraid to call your kids out. Don't be afraid to hold your kids accountable. That's what part of in raising them up and instructing them in the disciplines and the ways of God means. Deuteronomy, I've read this passage just a couple weeks ago during our child and parent dedication. In Deuteronomy, the words of Moses, he said this, he says, teach these commands, teach these things about God diligently to your children. Talk about them when you sit in your homes, when you walk down the streets, when you're just doing life. Teach the things of God to your kids. Parents, can I tell you this? You are the primary disciple makers of your kids. Here's what I mean by that. You are the primary one responsible for teaching them the things of God, the commands of God, and what it means to live as a follower of Jesus. That is primarily your job. It is not the primary job of our children's ministry and our children's ministry programs and our student ministry and our youth ministry programs. Those programs of our church are there, and the people that valiantly serve in those, they are there to support what you should already be doing at home. You are the primary disciple maker of your kids. You are the primary example of a follower of Jesus that they are looking to. Are you teaching your kids to pray? Are you teaching your kids to spend time in the Word of God? Are you teaching your kids what it means to serve God, what it means to worship? Are you teaching your kids what it means to live like Jesus would want you to live? I'm going to tell you, you are doing that through your words and your actions. They are learning from you. They are either learning that all of those things are important or they're secondary. Through your words and your actions, your kids are learning that these things about learning to pray, be in God's Word, be a part of a church family, to serve, to worship, to live like Jesus. They are learning that from you, and they are either learning how to do that well, or they are learning how to just make that secondary in their life. What are you teaching your kids? See, from these words that we see from Paul, submission, sacrifice, sacred in our marriages, to see these words of honor and disciple, maybe you need to reshape how you are doing relationships within your family. Maybe within your marriage, you need to reshape some things so that these words like submission and sacrifice and sacred are actually words that would describe your marriage. Maybe you need to reshape the relationships between parents and kids in your life, whatever stage that is right now, so words would actually like honor and disciple would actually describe those relationships within your family. Maybe you need to start living life as a family a little different today. And maybe those changes start by you just kind of putting a stamp on today. Putting a marker on today that God may be stirring in you some way. Not what the person on the other side of that relationship could do, but what you could do within that relationship. Maybe today you just need some time with God and say, God, help me to do this better. God, help me to start living this out in this relationship within my family. And I want to give you time to pray. So I'm going to ask you to close your eyes. And in this time of prayer, it may need to just be a time of prayer for you personally. Maybe this time of prayer needs to be a time of prayer for you and your spouse together. Maybe this time of prayer needs to be prayer for you and maybe some of your kids that you have in this room with you today. That you just want to mark this. That, hey, we need to reshape and live out this relationship a little differently than we have. So I'm going to give you space and time right now for prayer. I'm also going to say this. I know the room is a little crowded today, but we're going to open up this front edge of our platform today as an altar of prayer. And maybe you need to just nudge someone that's on the aisle that you can just get by, and maybe you need to by yourself or with your spouse, or you grab your kids. You need to come up here and you need to just kneel at this altar of prayer to spend some time in prayer, marking that there's something that you're going to start doing differently in your relationship today than you did yesterday. Let's go to this time of prayer right now. And maybe you may be saying, I'd love for someone to pray with me. I'm going to be up here. If you want me to pray with you, just get my attention. I will happily come down and pray with you. But let's spend some time in prayer. And if this needs to be your space right here, this altar prayer, come on, grab your spouse, grab your kids. Come and make this a place of prayer right now. God, today, I pray over marriages. I lift these husbands and these wives to you. I pray that you would strengthen marriages. I pray that you would give them courage to make changes where changes are needed. God, I pray for moms and dads in these rooms in all different stages of parenting, that you would give them wisdom, understanding, courage. Would you teach us what it means to live out these words within the relationships of our home? In this moment, I want you to continue being in a place of prayer. If that's what you need, you stay right there in that place of prayer. We're going to go into a song of worship. If you want to join singing, you join singing. If you want to stay praying, you stay praying. You do whatever it is that you need to do in this moment.